The red pen hovered over yet another meandering paragraph. This one describing how a forest fire had destroyed the students' childhood home, forcing their family to start over. The essay was raw and honest, exactly what I'd asked for in my American Gothic Literature and Personal Narrative seminar. Too honest, maybe. I set the pen down and leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking in the silence of my office at Northern Michigan University. Monday afternoons were always quiet on this side of campus. Most faculty cleared out after their morning classes, but I preferred grading when the hallways emptied. The students' descriptions of smoke and flames, of cherished objects turned to ash, pulled at something inside me. Not the fire, we'd never had one at our cabin, but the loss. The sudden total change. I rubbed my eyes and checked the clock. 4:18 p.m. The wind shook the window behind me, bringing the first bite of winter. November in Marquette brought early darkness and memories I'd spent decades trying to outrun. My phone buzzed. A text from the department chair about tomorrow's faculty meeting. I replied with a quick confirmation, then returned to the essays. But the students' words had done their work, cracking open a door I usually kept firmly shut. At 38, I'd made a life pretty different from my childhood. Professor Thomas Wilson had little in common with 10-year-old Tommy, who grew up in that small cabin 8 miles outside Marquette. My colleagues knew me as careful, quiet, which helped me get my tenure track job. What they didn't know was where those traits came from. Growing up in the early 90s meant isolation for a kid in the Upper Peninsula. Our cabin sat at the end of a gravel road, with pines and hardwoods all around. No neighbors, no cable TV, no distractions from my father's version of building character. Robert Wilson believed boys became men through calluses and sweat. By age 7, I had daily chores that would have seemed excessive even to other rural families. By 8, I could split logs with an axe. By 9, I tracked deer through fresh snow and helped butcher what we brought home. These weren't options or games, they were expectations. "A Wilson pulls his weight," my father would say, his face weathered even then, eyes constantly scanning the tree line as though looking for something. I never questioned why he was always watching the woods. That came later. The memories came back as I looked at the ungraded essay. My 10th birthday didn't have a cake or presents wrapped in colorful paper. Instead, my father gave me a .22 rifle, putting it in my hands like it was a really important moment. "A gun makes you a provider, not a hero," he'd said, his calloused hand heavy on my shoulder. "You respect what it does. You honor what it takes." My mother, Sarah, had watched from the doorway. She never contradicted my father, at least not in front of me. But that night she'd slipped into my room with a small wrapped package, a compass with my initials engraved on the back. "So you always find your way home," she'd whispered. The contradiction of my parents shaped me more than either probably realized. Father with his strict expectations, mother with her quiet acts of kindness. But neither was my true companion during those isolated years. That role belonged to Bandit. The memory of him made me push away from my desk. I walked to the window, watching students hurry across the quad, heads down against the wind. Bandit had been an Airedale Terrier with wiry fur and tons of energy. Dad had brought him home as a puppy when I was 8. Not as a pet, but as a working dog. But from the first night, when he'd snuck into my bed and curled against my chest, he was mine. If I closed my eyes, I could still feel his coarse fur against my fingers, still hear his excited bark when I returned from school. He'd follow me everywhere, chopping wood, checking traps, exploring the streams and ridges near our property. He slept at the foot of my bed every night for 2 years. The wind picked up outside my office window, blowing dead leaves around. Fall. It always brought the memories back more clearly, especially thoughts of that particular autumn. 1995. The fall, everything changed. Thanksgiving approached, and with it, the annual family gathering. Uncles, aunts, and cousins would come to my grandfather's bigger property, 20 miles deeper into the woods. That year, My father decided I was old enough for a special responsibility. "Time you showed everyone what you're made of," he said one evening in early November. The fire crackled in the wood stove as he reached behind his chair and pulled out his most prized possession, the Winchester that had belonged to his father. He rarely let anyone touch it, this relic from a harder time. "You're going to provide the main course this year," he continued, holding the rifle with reverence before extending it toward me. "Bring back something that'll make everyone proud." My mother looked up from her mending. Concern flashed across her face before she smoothed it away. "He's ready, Robert?" My father nodded once, firmly. "He's a Wilson." I took the Winchester, surprised by its weight, by the worn smoothness of the wood stock that had been handled by generations before me. Pride filled my chest, along with a flutter of nervousness. This wasn't the .22 I'd been practicing with. This was the real thing. A man's gun. "Don't let me down," my father said, his eyes holding mine. There was something else there, too, something I couldn't name then. Worry? Fear? Whatever it was, it vanished quickly behind his usual stern expression. "I won't," I promised. The next morning would be my first solo hunt with the Winchester. Bandit would accompany me, of course. He always did. I went to bed that night filled with anticipation, visualizing the perfect shot, imagining the approval on my father's face when I returned successful. I didn't know then that I'd return changed, that we all would. I turned from the window in my university office. 28 years later, and sometimes I still felt just like that same kid. I woke before my alarm, too excited to sleep any longer. My grandfather's Winchester leaned against my bedroom wall where I'd propped it the night before. Bandit sensed my excitement, his tail thumping against the floor as I dressed in layers for the November chill. The kitchen light glowed yellow as I moved quietly, fixing myself a quick breakfast. Mom had left a thermos of hot chocolate and a wrapped sandwich on the counter with a note. "Good luck, Tommy. Be careful." Dad was already outside, checking the truck before heading to his construction job. He stopped me at the door, giving me a long look. "Remember what I taught you," he said, adjusting the collar of my jacket. "One clean shot. Make it count." "I will, Dad." "Bandit stays with you at all times," he added, an unusual hint of concern in his voice. "Back before dark, no exceptions." I nodded, picking up the Winchester like I'd done many times before. It was heavier than my .22. Bandit walked around my legs, eager to get going. Dad got in his truck but rolled down the window. "A Wilson provides," he called out, our family motto almost. "A Wilson provides," I repeated, standing straighter. The forest welcomed us as the first light spread through the trees. Frost crunched under my boots, and my breath clouded in front of my face. November in the Upper Peninsula meant serious cold, but I hardly noticed it. This hunt mattered. My first real chance to prove myself to Dad, to the whole family. Bandit trotted ahead, nose to the ground, perfectly in his element. We'd trained together for smaller game, but he knew this was different. I could tell by the way he moved, more focused, less playful. The woods stretched for miles in every direction. Our property connected to state forest land, creating an unbroken wilderness that made me feel tiny. Usually I felt comfortable there. I had space to breathe, to explore, to escape Dad's watchful eyes for a few hours. Today, it felt like a test. I worried the size of the forest would make it harder to succeed. I followed deer trails deeper into the trees, checking for fresh tracks, rubbed bark, or droppings. Dad had taught me to look for signs in the forest, to notice where branches were broken or leaves disturbed. Bandit ranged ahead, occasionally looking back to make sure I followed. The morning slipped away. 1 hour became 2, then 3. My shoulders ached from carrying the Winchester, and disappointment settled heavy in my stomach. Other kids got video games for their birthdays. I got the chance to freeze in the woods and fail in front of my father. By mid-morning, I was getting really frustrated and losing confidence. I'd seen nothing worth shooting, just squirrels and chickadees. Bandit seemed to pick up on my mood, staying closer, occasionally pressing his warm body against my leg. "What am I going to tell Dad?" I asked Bandit, scratching behind his ears. "That I walked around for hours and came back empty-handed?" Bandit looked up at me with those brown eyes that always seemed to understand everything. I know. Keep trying." I pushed onward, moving toward the small marsh where Dad said migratory birds sometimes stopped. I pictured returning home with the Winchester in one hand and a big buck dragged behind me with the other. Dad would clap me on the shoulder, maybe even smile. "That's my boy," he'd say. The fantasy kept me going as the sun climbed higher. I stepped carefully, watching where I placed each foot to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. The temperature had warmed enough to melt the morning frost, making the forest floor slightly damp and quiet under my boots. Just as I considered turning back, a sound caught my attention, the unmistakable honking of geese. I looked up through gaps in the branches and saw them, a V formation passing overhead. Without thinking, I raised the Winchester, tracking the lead bird through the iron sights just as Dad had taught me. "Lead the target," his words came back to me. "They're moving faster than you think." I exhaled halfway, steadied my arms, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked against my shoulder, the report crashing through the quiet forest. One goose folded mid-flight, plummeting through the branches. I'd done it. Joy surged through me as I ran to where the bird had fallen. It was a clean kill. Through the body, not messy. Perfect. I picked up the goose, still warm, and felt a bubble of pride expand in my chest. Not a deer, but a respectable showing for Thanksgiving. Something I'd shot with Grandpa's gun. "Look, Bandit." I turned to show him, already picturing Dad's reaction. That's when I noticed the change in Bandit's posture. His body went rigid, ears forward, the fur along his spine standing on end. A low growl vibrated from his chest, a sound I'd never heard him make before. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, reaching for his collar. Before my fingers could touch him, Bandit bolted. He shot between the trees like he'd been fired from a gun himself, barking like crazy in a way that made my stomach knot up. "Bandit!" I shouted, shoving the goose into my game bag. "Bandit, come back!" I took off after him, Winchester clutched in my hands, branches whipping against my face. Bandit never disobeyed, never ran off. Something was wrong. I followed his barking through a stand of pines, then across a small creek. His voice changed from alarm to something worse, pain mixed with fear. The sound pushed me faster, my chest tight with each breath. "Bandit!" I called again, panic edging my voice. I pushed through the bushes into a small clearing and stopped cold. A deer was lying on its side, its legs barely moving, with its throat ripped open. Blood soaked the leaves around it, and steam rose from the red puddle in the cool air. I froze for only a second before I heard something worse from my left. Bandit's whimper suddenly cut off. About 20 feet away behind a fallen log was Bandit. His body was twitching, and I thought at first he was just hurt and needed help. Then I saw it, his stomach torn open, his guts spilled out onto the ground. And bent over him, with its back to me, was something my brain couldn't make sense of. The thing had no hair, with sick-looking pale skin pulled tight over what looked like just bones. It made wet, slurping sounds as it ate my dog, its long fingers with way too many joints pulling at Bandit's insides. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The Winchester just hung there useless in my hands that had gone numb. Then the thing stopped. It went completely still, like a video on pause. Slowly, it turned toward me, and I saw its face. Something straight out of a nightmare. Where eyes should be, there were just smooth dents. Its nose was just 2 slits above a mouth that stretched way too wide across its face. It didn't look at me exactly, more like it pointed its face my way. Its nostrils opened wide, taking quick, shallow breaths. It tilted its head like it was listening. Right then, I realized something for sure. It couldn't see me, but it could tell I was there somehow. My movement, my smell, some sound I made. Something was giving me away. I just stood there frozen, watching this thing that killed my dog sniff the air between us. One thought kept repeating in my head, drowning out everything else. Don't move, don't move, don't move. I couldn't move. The creature kept feeding on Bandit, making wet, sickly sounds as it pulled at his insides. My muscles locked in place, my mind screaming to run while my body refused to obey. Every instinct told me that movement meant death. The thing paused again, its noseless face turning slightly to the left, then right. It seemed to be listening, testing the air. After what felt like hours, but must have been seconds, it returned to Bandit's body, tearing away chunks with those long, jointed fingers. I wanted to shoot it. The Winchester weighed heavy in my hands. A simple movement of finger on trigger, all that was needed. But terror glued me in place, convinced that any sound would bring those teeth toward my throat next. Eventually, the creature straightened. It wiped its elongated hands across what passed for its mouth, smearing dark fluid across its pale skin. Then it grabbed Bandit's remains, dragging them with unnatural strength toward the denser part of the forest. The deer carcass followed, pulled by its other arm. Only when it disappeared into the trees did my body unlock. My legs buckled, and I dropped to my knees. A sob built in my throat, but I swallowed it down. The thing might still hear me. I scrambled up, the Winchester slipping from my numb fingers to the forest floor. The goose I'd shot lay forgotten in my game bag as I turned and ran. Branches whipped my face, roots tried to trip me, but nothing mattered except getting away. The forest that had been my second home became an endless maze of terror. Every shadow held danger, every sound the creature returning. I ran without direction until I spotted a familiar deer trail, then followed it blindly, stumbling and gasping. The cabin appeared ahead, and my pace quickened. Tears flowed freely now, hot tracks down my cold face. I burst through the door, letting it bang against the wall. Dad jerked upright from his chair, surprise turning to confusion as he took in my appearance. I must have looked wild. Face scratched from branches, clothes dirty from falling, eyes wide with horror. Tommy? He stood, setting aside the book he'd been reading. What happened? Where's... His eyes dropped to my empty hands. Then he looked behind me like he was expecting to see what I was carrying. His face got hard. Where's the gun? I tried to speak, but only ragged breaths came out. My whole body shook. Bandit, I finally managed. He's dead. There was a thing in the woods. It killed him. Dad's expression changed, his jaw tightening. What thing? A monster, I said, the words sounding childish even to my ears. It was eating a deer. Then it got Bandit. It had no eyes, just holes, and fingers with too many joints, and... Stop. Dad raised his hand. The word cut through my rambling like a blade. Where is my father's rifle? Mom came from the kitchen then, drying her hands on a towel. Robert, what's going on? She looked at me, worry on her face. Tommy, you're shaking. He came back without the Winchester, Dad said, his voice flat. Says some monster got Bandit. I'm not lying, my voice cracked. It killed him. It tore him open and ate him right in front of me. Dad's expression changed from anger to something worse, disappointment. Making up stories won't bring back my father's rifle. Robert, Mom said quietly, moving toward me. Look at him. Something happened. Something happened, all right. Dad grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. We're going back right now to get the truth. My stomach plunged. No, Dad, we can't go back there. It's still out there. He paused, one arm in his jacket sleeve. You left your grandfather's Winchester in the woods because you got scared. Fine. You're 10. but lying about it? He shook his head. "A Wilson faces the truth." Mom placed her hand on my shoulder. "Maybe you should let him calm down first, Robert. The sun sets in an hour. We go now." He held my coat out to me. "Put this on." My legs barely carried me as we left the cabin. Mom watched from the door, her face tight with worry. The woods looked different now, threatening in a way they never had before. Dad walked ahead, his back straight, shoulders set in a way that left no room for argument. The silence between us stretched. Usually Dad talked while we walked, pointing out tracks or teaching me the names of trees. Now there was nothing but the sound of our boots on fallen leaves. "Dad," I tried once. "I'm not making it up." "We'll see." The sun was getting lower in the sky by the time we reached the clearing. I hung back, not wanting to see what might be waiting. Dad stopped abruptly. "This where it happened?" I nodded, unable to look. He moved forward, looking at the ground carefully. I forced myself to join him, staying close to his side. The clearing was empty. No bandit, no deer, but dark, rust-colored stains soaked the fallen leaves and moss. In places, the earth had been messed up, leaves scattered in violent patterns. Dad crouched, touching the largest blood stain with his fingertips. "See?" I pointed at the stains. "That's bandit's blood. And over there, that's where the deer was. The thing dragged them both away." Dad stood, wiping his fingers on his pants. His face had reddened, whether from exertion or anger I couldn't tell. "Still sticking to your monster story?" He walked to the fallen log and reached behind it, pulling out the Winchester. "Found this at least." He checked it over carefully, jaw tight. Then he slung it over his shoulder, looking around once more. "Animals drag away carcasses all the time," he said finally. "A coyote probably got your dog. Happens in these woods." "It wasn't a coyote." My voice rose. "I know what I saw." "Where's that goose you shot?" Dad asked, ignoring my outburst. "You did shoot something, didn't you?" I reached for my game bag, then froze. In my panic, I'd forgotten all about the goose. I dropped it when I ran." Dad's eyes narrowed. "So you shot a goose? Bandit ran off? And instead of looking for him, you dropped everything and ran home with a wild story about monsters?" He shook his head. "That's not how I raised you." "I'm telling the truth." I jabbed my finger toward the bloodstains. "Look at all the blood. That's not from a coyote." Dad studied the ground again, his face scrunched up. For a second, I thought he might believe me. Then he straightened, adjusting the Winchester on his shoulder. "Let's go home before dark," he said, his voice softer but no less final. "Your mother will be worried." As we turned to leave, I took one last look at the clearing. In the fading light, the bloodstains looked black against the forest floor, spreading out across the ground. Somewhere in these woods, that thing was still out there, with what remained of Bandit. Dad placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, guiding me away. "Now where's that goose you shot?" "Now where's that goose you shot?" Dad asked, squinting at the darkening forest floor. I pointed in the general direction I'd been running from. "Back that way, I think. I dropped it when I heard Bandit." Dad grunted, adjusting the Winchester on his shoulder. He started walking in the direction I'd pointed, looking at the ground carefully. I stayed close behind him. The idea of going deeper into the forest again made my stomach twist. "We're not leaving a perfectly good bird out here," he said, his voice quieter than before. "And you need to learn that running away doesn't solve problems." I wanted to tell him again that I wasn't making up stories, that the bloodstains proved something had killed Bandit, but arguing with Dad never changed his mind. Instead, I followed in silence, my body stiff as we moved through the increasingly dark woods. We searched for about 10 minutes, retracing what I thought was my path. The light was fading faster now, the sun sinking behind the trees. Dad walked confidently, not showing any of the fear that still had my hands shaking. That's when I noticed the silence. The forest was always full of sounds, chickadees calling, squirrels rustling through branches, the occasional distant crow. Now there was nothing, just our footsteps on the damp leaves and the sound of our breathing. "Dad," I said, my voice barely audible. "What?" He didn't look up from examining the ground. "Listen." He stood up straight, turning his head a bit. I knew he heard it too. The total silence. His eyes narrowed as they looked over the trees around us. "Let's head back," I said, "Nip, please. Not without that goose." But his voice had lost its certainty. We kept looking, Dad moving more cautiously now. I stayed within arm's reach, the back of my neck prickling. Something was watching us. I could feel it, a pressure in the air, an attention focused on our movements. "Dad," I whispered again, "we need to go." He ignored me, bending down to check a patch of disturbed leaves. The Winchester was still slung over his shoulder, not ready in his hands where it should have been. A branch snapped somewhere behind us. I grabbed Dad's sleeve, tugging hard. "Did you hear that?" "Just the wind," he said, brushing my hand away. But there was no wind. The air was still and cold around us, the trees not moving at all. Then came a sound that made me freeze, a wet, raspy breathing like someone choking. It came from behind some pine trees about 30 yards away. Dad finally stopped looking around and turned toward the noise. He stiffened up. He grabbed his Winchester off his shoulder and quickly raised it, ready to shoot. The pale thing came out from between the trees, crawling on all fours like a person but all wrong. Its arms and legs were too long, bending in weird ways. Its skin was tight on its bones, a dirty white color as daylight was ending. When it raised its head, I could see it had no eyes, just empty holes that somehow pointed right at us. I watched Dad's face change. His doubt disappeared and turned to fear as he realized I'd been telling the truth all along. His jaw tightened, the muscle in his cheek twitching. "Don't move," he breathed, so quietly I barely heard him. The creature's head tilted, its nostril slits flaring as it sniffed the air. It took one jerky step forward, then another. Dad's finger moved to the trigger. "When I shoot, you run," he whispered. "Straight home, don't stop, don't look back." The gunshot blasted through the quiet forest, the sound bouncing between trees. The creature jerked when the bullet hit its shoulder, black fluid spraying from the wound. But it didn't fall. It didn't even stagger back. Instead, its mouth with no lips opened silently, showing rows of needle-thin teeth. Then it charged, running crazy fast in a scrambling way that looked completely wrong. "Run!" Dad grabbed my arm, yanking me backward. We turned and sprinted through the forest, branches whipping at our faces. I'd never seen Dad run like that, not even when he raced me for fun. His hand gripped my upper arm so hard it hurt, but that grip saved me when my foot caught a root and I pitched forward. He hauled me upright without stopping, practically dragging me for several steps until I found my footing again. "Keep going!" he shouted, risking a glance over his shoulder. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know how close it was. The sound of its breathing drove us forward, that terrible wet rasping growing louder when we slowed, fading slightly when we pushed harder. The tree line appeared ahead, then the clearing around our cabin. We burst from the woods, legs burning, lungs heaving. Dad pushed me ahead of him across the yard. "Inside! Now!" Mom stood in the doorway, her face going pale as she saw us running. "Robert? Tommy? What?" "Inside," Dad repeated, shoving me through the door past her, then slamming it shut behind us. His hands were shaking as he slid the deadbolt into place, then reached for the box of shells on the shelf by the door. "Robert, what happened?" Mom asked, backing away from the door. Dad didn't answer as he broke open the Winchester, hands trembling so badly he dropped the first shell. He cursed, something he never did in front of me, and tried again, managing to load a fresh round. I pressed my face to the window, searching the tree line. "Is it following us?" "Get away from the window," Dad snapped, pulling me back. He took my place, peering through the glass, the Winchester ready in his hands. Dad stayed by the window all night, Winchester ready, watching the tree line. Mom tried asking questions, but his answers came in short bursts between long stretches of silence. I huddled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, too scared to go to my room alone. It was some kind of animal, Dad finally told Mom, his voice flat. Attacked Bandit, came after us. What kind of animal? Mom asked. Dad's eyes never left the window. Don't know. I opened my mouth to tell her the truth, that it wasn't any animal, that it was something impossible, but Dad cut me off with a sharp look. The warning in his eyes was clear. Keep quiet. We slept in the living room that night, all three of us. Dad didn't sleep at all. Every time I woke up, I found him in the same position, looking out at the darkness, the Winchester across his lap. By morning, Dad had made a list. He drove to town and came back with new deadbolts, window locks, and enough canned food to last a month. Mom watched him install everything without asking more questions, but her eyes followed him with new worry. He worked carefully, testing each lock multiple times, making sure nothing could get in. The next day, he drove to Marquette again and came back with a for sale sign that he hammered into the frozen ground next to our mailbox. I watched from the window as he pulled out all his traps from the shed and loaded them into the truck. "What are you doing with those?" I asked when he came back inside. "Selling them," he said, removing his gloves finger by finger. "Not hunting anymore." Mom looked up from the potatoes she was peeling. "Robert, are you sure?" "We need the money," was all he said. In the following days, Dad sold almost everything. His compound bow, the skinning knives, the fishing gear, even his collection of antler trophies that had hung on our walls for as long as I could remember. The only things he kept were his father's Winchester and 2 boxes of ammunition, which never moved from their spot by the front door. School started again after Thanksgiving break, but everything felt different. The other kids talked about what they got for Christmas, what they did during the snow days, which high school team won the hockey tournament. None of it mattered. While they laughed at lunch, I kept seeing Bandit's insides spilling onto the forest floor, kept hearing that wet breathing getting closer behind us as we ran. Mrs. Patterson called me to her desk during art time. "Tommy, do you want to tell me about your drawing?" I looked down at the paper where I'd drawn the thing from the woods. I'd tried to get it right. The pale, stretched skin, the too many joints in its fingers, the holes where eyes should have been. I shook my head. "You've been very quiet since coming back from break," she said, tipping her head to look at my face. "Is everything okay at home?" I nodded, not meeting her eyes. "You know you can talk to me about anything that's bothering you." I clutched my pencil tighter, pressing the tip until it broke against the paper. "I'm fine." When I got home that day, Mom was on the phone, her back to me as I came through the door. "Yes, Mrs. Patterson. I understand your concern. No, nothing unusual has happened at home." Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of beer in front of him. He never drank before dinner. "Your teacher called," he said when Mom hung up. "Said you're drawing monsters." I stared at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. "Let me see your backpack." I handed it over without argument. He pulled out my folder and flipped through my schoolwork until he found the drawings, not just today's, but others I'd made during the week when I was supposed to be working on math. 5 drawings of the creature, each one trying to capture what I'd seen. Dad's face went hard. He took the drawings to the wood stove, opened the iron door, and fed them in one by one. The paper curled and blackened in the flames. "Tommy," he said, still watching the fire consume my drawings, "what did you see in the woods that day?" "The monster," I whispered. He turned to face me. "And what did I tell the police when they came looking for the Miller boy last week? That we didn't see anything unusual." "That's right." Dad crouched down so we were eye to eye. "Some things we keep in the family. You understand? People will think you're crazy if you talk about monsters. They'll think we're both crazy." "But it was real," I said, my voice breaking. You saw it too. I know what I saw, he said quietly. And I know what happens to people who talk about things like that. His hand gripped my shoulder. We protect our own. That means we keep quiet about some things. Even if it's the truth? Especially if it's the truth. That night I heard Mom and Dad arguing in their bedroom. I crept down the hallway, sitting just outside their door where their voices carried. We should move, Mom said, her voice pleading. You know what you saw. This is our home, Dad shot back. I won't be chased off. What about Tommy? He's not the same since whatever happened out there. He'll be fine. Boys bounce back. Do they? Because you haven't been the same either, Robert. You jump at every sound. You barely sleep. You sold everything you used to love doing. I'm protecting this family. By keeping us here? After what happened to Bandit? After whatever you saw in those woods? There was a long silence. When Dad spoke again, his voice was lower. Sarah, we've put everything we have into this place. Where would we go? What would we do? Anywhere else, Mom said. A place without those woods. And live how? On what? The argument continued, but I slipped back to my bed, pulling the blankets over my head. I knew we wouldn't move. Dad never changed his mind once it was set. Winter turned harsh after that. Snow piled against the cabin walls in deep drifts, and the wind howled around the corners at night. I used to love winter, sledding down the hill behind our house, making snow forts, tracking animal prints through fresh powder. Now I stayed inside, watching the woods through frosted windows. I only went outside when Dad made me help with chores, and even then, I never turned my back on the tree line. The snow began melting in late March. As patches of ground poked through the snow, Dad started marking off the yard with wooden stakes and string. On a Saturday morning, he woke me early. Get dressed, he said. We're going to town for supplies. We drove to the hardware store where Dad bought lumber, chicken wire, and metal posts. The man behind the counter raised his eyebrows at the amount. Building a chicken coop, Bob? A fence, Dad said, handling over cash. Pretty extensive fencing. What are you keeping in, or out? Dad didn't answer, just counted his change and headed for the door. Every day after school and all weekend, we worked on the fence. Dad dug post holes while the ground was still partially frozen, cursing as he chipped through the hard earth. I helped carry materials and held posts while he cemented them in place. By the end of April, a 6-foot fence encircled our property, the chicken wire reinforced with wooden slats that restricted the view into the surrounding forest. Dad built a gate with a heavy chain and padlock for the driveway. One evening in May, I found Dad on the porch, smoking a cigarette, another new habit since that day in the woods. The air smelled like spring, with buds forming on the trees and the last bits of snow finally melting away. Dad, I said, leaning against the railing beside him. Can we get another dog? He took a long drag, the tip of his cigarette flaring orange in the dusk. No, but I miss having a dog. And you said a dog is good protection. There's no replacing Bandit, he said, his voice softening for just a moment before hardening again. And a dog wouldn't have protected you anyway. Not from that thing. It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging what we'd seen since that night. Is it still out there? I asked, the question I'd been afraid to voice for months. Dad flicked his cigarette into the yard, watching the ember bounce and die against the damp ground. Yes. How do you know? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was tight. I just know. And so do you. He was right. I'd always known deep down that the creature was still out in the woods. The fence, the locks, the Winchester by the door. None of that stuff changed what I knew was true. We were stuck with the memory of what we saw that day. The university campus disappeared in my rearview mirror as I took the highway north toward Marquette County. My colleagues had given me curious looks when I'd announced my sabbatical plans. "You never talk about your father," Dr. Ramirez had said during our department meeting. "And now you're taking a semester to care for him?" I'd shrugged, not knowing how to explain that some bonds weren't about liking each other. Some were about duty, history, and secrets no one else would believe. The drive took 5 hours from Northern Michigan University, though I'd only made it twice in the last 10 years, once for Mom's funeral 6 years ago, and before that for a Christmas visit that ended with Dad and me barely talking. I passed all the usual spots, the gas station, the old paper mill, and the turn onto County Road 553 that went deeper into the woods. My car bounced over the dirt road leading to the property. My stomach tightened as trees packed in tight on both sides. I'd spent years in therapy trying to make sense of what Dad and I had seen that day in November 1995. My therapist had nodded patiently, telling me how trauma and fear can mess with what you see, especially as a kid. Sometimes I almost believed her. Almost. The cabin came into view, looking smaller than I remembered. The wooden fence Dad had built years ago was now falling apart, with whole sections drooping or completely gone. Dead leaves had piled up at the bottom, looking like nobody had raked in months. The for sale sign was gone. Dad never actually sold the place or moved away like Mom wanted. I parked next to Dad's old Ford pickup. The truck's paint had worn away to gray with rust on the wheels. When Uncle Jim called about Dad's stroke, he told me the doctors took away his driving privileges. Not that he goes anywhere, Uncle Jim had said. Barely leaves the house these days. My bags felt really heavy as I took them from the trunk. The afternoon sun was low behind the trees, but the cabin windows were dark. I stopped at the front step, key in hand. After being away so long, it felt weird to just walk in. I knocked and waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder. "Dad, it's Thomas." No response. I got really nervous. Had he suffered another stroke? I twisted the key in the lock and pushed open the door. The cabin smelled musty, like old books and wood smoke. I squinted to see in the darkness. The curtains were pulled shut on every window, letting in only small bits of light. "Dad?" I called again, setting my bags down just inside the door. A figure moved in the living room. I spotted someone sitting in the old armchair that had always been Dad's spot. "You came." His voice sounded rougher than I remembered, like it was worn down by age. As my eyes got used to the darkness, I could see him better. Dad had always been big and solid, but the man in the chair looked smaller somehow, like he'd shrunk. His face had new wrinkles, deep lines around his mouth and between his eyebrows. His hair had turned completely gray. But what caught my attention most was the Winchester rifle across his lap. The same one I'd dropped in the forest that day. The one he'd used to shoot the creature when it attacked us. "Of course I came," I said, stepping farther into the room. "Jim said you needed help after the stroke." Dad's eyes never left mine, checking me out with that uncomfortable staring thing he'd always done. His right hand sat on the Winchester's stock, left hand near the trigger guard, not pointing it at me, but not relaxed either. "What's with the gun?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual as I set down my other bag. Dad's fingers tightened on the rifle. Something flickered in his eyes that took me back 28 years in an instant. That same look I'd seen when we'd burst from the woods running for our lives. "It's back," he whispered. 2 words. That was all it took for ice to fill my veins, for the nightmares to rush forward from wherever I'd locked them away. I stared at him, waiting for him to crack a smile, to tell me he was just testing me. But the fear in his eyes was real. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. "Started 3 months ago," Dad said, his voice steadier now that he was sharing information. "First, pets disappeared from houses down the road. The Miller's German Shepherd taken right from their yard. Then the Anderson cat, 3 more after that." I stepped closer and turned on a lamp next to the couch. The bright light made Dad blink, but he kept going. "Then the Miller boy went missing. Peter, 10 years old, was riding his bike on the county road. Never came home." A sick feeling hit my gut. Could have been anything, I said, not buying it myself. Coyotes grab pets all the time, and kids run away. Dad's mouth tightened. That what you tell yourself at night? That what you've been telling yourself for 28 years? I didn't answer. We both knew I still had nightmares about that day, about Bandit lying torn open, about running through the woods with that wet breathing getting closer behind us. You've seen it? I finally asked, sinking onto the couch across from him. Dad nodded once, a sharp downward jerk of his chin. By the old oak. Same as before. Same everything. Did you tell the police about the boy? What could I say? Dad's laugh was bitter. That I saw the same monster that killed a dog 28 years ago? That no one believed us about then? He was right. We'd never told anyone the full truth of what we saw. When the police had come around asking about the Miller boy back then, the first Peter Miller, we'd said we hadn't seen anything strange in the woods. Could be coincidence, I said weakly. You don't believe that? I didn't. The timing was too perfect. My father's stroke bringing me back just as the thing showed up again, as if it had been waiting all this time. How's your recovery going? I asked, changing the subject. Jim said it was a minor stroke. Dad waved a hand dismissively. Left side was weak for a couple weeks. Better now. He tapped the Winchester with one finger. Can still shoot straight. I looked around the cabin. It looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in months. Mail was piled on the kitchen table, dishes stacked in the sink. A single plate with leftover canned stew sat on the coffee table. When did Mom's houseplants die? I asked, noticing the row of brown, withered stems on the windowsill that had once been Mom's pride. After she did, Dad said flatly. The words hung in the air between us. 6 years, and we'd never really talked about Mom's death. I'd come for the funeral, stayed 3 days, and left. Dad hadn't called once since. I'm going to unpack, I said, standing up. Then I'll make us some dinner. Dad nodded, but his eyes looked toward the window, toward the woods past the old fence. His fingers stayed on the Winchester. I picked up my bags and went to my old bedroom. Dad had kept it mostly the same, though the posters I'd had on the walls were gone, leaving behind lighter squares of paint. My bed had fresh sheets. He must have gotten ready for me coming home, even though he wasn't doing well. I sat on the edge of the bed, touching the quilt Mom had made years ago. The walls felt too close, the woods too near. We were back where we started, Dad and I, with the Winchester and the creature and the fear that lived between the trees. But this time, I wasn't a child. This time, whatever was out there wouldn't find us unprepared. I spent my first full day at the cabin cleaning. Dad watched from his armchair, the Winchester never leaving his lap, as I scrubbed counters and swept floors thick with dust. The physical labor helped quiet my mind, pushing away thoughts of what might be in the woods beyond our property. You don't have to do all that, Dad said as I wiped down the refrigerator shelves. Place needs it. I dumped another container of expired food into the trash. When's the last time you went grocery shopping? He shrugged. Jim brings things sometimes. By evening, I'd made a list of supplies we needed and drove to the small general store in town. The cashier, an older woman with gray hair and a tight bun, looked me over as she rang up my items. You're Bob Wilson's boy, she said. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. Heard he had a stroke. How's he doing? Better. I'm staying with him for a while. She nodded, bagging my groceries quickly. Good. Man shouldn't be alone out there, especially with what's been happening. I paused. What's been happening? You haven't heard? She lowered her voice. 5 pets gone missing in the last 3 months. 2 hikers never came back from a day trip up near Hogback Mountain. And now that poor Miller boy. My stomach tightened. What happened to him? Disappeared 3 weeks ago. Was riding his bike on County Road 553. They found the bike, but no boy. She shook her head. Search parties combed those woods for 2 weeks before they called it off. His poor parents. I paid for the groceries, my mind racing. Back at the cabin, I didn't mention the conversation to Dad. He had enough to worry about. The next morning, I drove into Marquette and found a copy of the local newspaper. Sure enough, there was a small article about the search for Peter Miller being officially suspended. 10 years old. Same age I'd been when we ran into the creature. Same name as the boy who disappeared back then. I spent the rest of the week gathering information. The library archives confirmed the pattern, the same as before. Pets disappearing first, then hikers, then a child. I checked online forums where local hunters posted. Several mentioned weird noises in the woods at night and game cameras going missing. At the diner in town, I sat alone with coffee and a sandwich, listening to the conversations around me. 2 men in flannel shirts and worn caps sat at the counter, their voices carrying. "Third camera this month," one was saying. "Just vanishes. No tracks, nothing." "You think it's kids?" his companion asked. "Kids don't go that deep in the woods, and they don't take just the camera and leave them out. What did you catch on the footage before it disappeared?" The first man paused. "Nothing clear. Just movement. And the deer all got scared at once, looking at something off camera. I noticed the pattern, the same as before. The creature was setting up its territory, getting rid of anything that might take its picture. It was hunting. Dad stayed by the window most days, Winchester ready, eyes checking the tree line. I brought him food, made sure he took his medication, tried to talk to him. Sometimes he'd talk about Mom, about the years after I left for college, but mostly he watched the woods with total focus. "You should go back to the university," he told me on the 5th night as I set a plate of dinner beside him. "Nothing you can do here. I'm not leaving you alone." He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since I'd arrived. "You still see it, don't you? In your dreams?" I didn't answer, which was answer enough. "It marked us somehow," Dad said quietly. "That day in the woods. It's been waiting. For what? For you to come back." I slept poorly that night, my dreams filled with pale limbs and wet breathing. Around 3 a.m, a hand shook me awake. Dad stood over my bed, finger to his lips, the Winchester in his other hand. "There," he whispered, pointing toward the window. I got up quietly and went to the window. The moon was bright in the yard. At first, I didn't see anything except the broken fence and the dark trees beyond. Then I noticed something moving. Near the trees, something pale moved between the trunks. I stopped breathing when it came partly into the moonlight. The creature from my nightmares. Skin tight over a long body, it moved in that same weird way I remembered, like a horrible copy of how humans move. Its limbs bent wrong as it crept along the edge of the woods, its head turning like it was checking out the cabin. I just stood there, my adult brain trying to make sense of what I'd seen as a kid all those years ago. It wasn't a bear standing up or a sick, hairless wolf like my therapist had tried to tell me. It wasn't anything normal. The creature stopped, lifting its face with no nose toward the air. Even from far away, I could see the awful holes where eyes should have been. It seemed to be smelling the air, its head turning toward our cabin like it knew exactly where we were. For a moment, I thought it looked right at our window, at me, even though I knew it couldn't see. Then it disappeared back into the darkness between the trees. Dad's hand grabbed my shoulder. "Told you," he whispered. We stayed up the rest of the night watching the woods, but the creature didn't show up again. Morning came with gray light coming through the clouds. Dad had finally fallen asleep in his chair around dawn. I made coffee and went onto the porch, looking around the yard in daylight. Nothing looked out of place until I walked to the edge of the property where the fence had completely fallen down. There, carefully arranged at the line between yard and forest, was a dead deer. Not ripped apart by normal animals, but cut open with terrible precision. The organs were gone, leaving the inside empty. The head was completely missing. I looked at the dead deer, feeling sick to my stomach. This wasn't a normal kill. This was a message. Dad came over walking slowly with his cane. He looked down at the deer remains without being surprised. "It knows we're here," he said. I called the police from my cell phone, reporting what we'd found. An officer arrived an hour later and looked skeptical, especially when he saw the deer. "Probably coyotes," he said, not bothering to get close. "They've been bad this year." "Coyotes don't do this," Dad argued. "Look at how clean the cuts are." The officer shrugged. "Could be someone dumped it. Poachers sometimes take just the head for antlers." "It's the same thing that took Peter Miller," I said. The officer's expression hardened. "Sir, we don't joke about that case." "I'm not joking. There's something in these woods. It took a boy 28 years ago, too, another Peter Miller. It's back." "Thomas," Dad warned, but I couldn't stop. "Check your missing persons records from 1995. Same name, same age. It's happening again." The officer took a step back. "I'll file a report about the deer. Please don't move the remains." He headed back to his cruiser without another word. Dad watched him drive away. "They never believe," he said quietly. "We buried the deer remains ourselves, neither of us wanting to look at them anymore." The rest of the day passed in tense silence. I tried calling the police station again, asking to speak with someone about the Miller case, but was politely dismissed. As evening approached, I made a decision. I couldn't sit and wait for the creature to come closer, to take another child, or to finally come for us. The police wouldn't help. No one would believe us without evidence. "I'm going out there," I told Dad as I laced up my hiking boots. He looked up sharply. "No. We need evidence. Pictures, tracks, something the police can't ignore. It'll kill you." It could have killed us both that day in the woods, but it didn't. It's been watching us for 28 years. I need to understand why. Dad stood with effort, grabbing the Winchester from where it leaned against his chair. "Not alone," he said. I wanted to refuse. His stroke had left him weaker than he admitted, and his hands weren't as steady as they once were. But the determination in his eyes stopped me. This was his fight too, had been for longer than mine. We prepared carefully. I found flashlights in the kitchen drawer and checked the batteries. Dad retrieved his old hunting knife from a box in the closet, testing the edge with his thumb before handing it to me. "Remember," he said as I tucked the knife into my belt, "it hunts by sound and smell. It can't see you, but it knows where you are." I nodded, the weight of the knife unfamiliar against my hip. Dad checked the Winchester one last time, loading fresh shells with fingers that trembled slightly. Outside, the sun was starting to go down behind the trees. The yard was getting darker as we got ready to head into the woods together. Dusk settled over the forest as Dad and I crossed the boundary where our yard ended and the wilderness began. The broken fence posts marked a line I hadn't crossed in 28 years, not since that day when Bandit died and something inhuman chased us back to the cabin. Now I was deliberately stepping over that line, my boots crunching on fallen pine needles and twigs. Dad moved more slowly beside me, the Winchester held ready in his hands. His breathing came heavier than it once had, the exertion of walking through uneven terrain clearly taxing him after his stroke. But his eyes remained sharp, looking over the deepening shadows between the trees with the same vigilance I remembered from childhood. "Stay close," he murmured, voice barely audible above the rustle of leaves overhead. I nodded, one hand resting on the hunting knife at my belt. The metal felt cold against my fingertips. Not much against what we were tracking, but better than nothing. The forest closed around us, looking both like home and somehow strange. These were the same trees I'd played among as a child, the same paths I'd walked with Bandit at my heels. But now everything seemed dangerous, like the woods had soaked up the evil of the creature hunting here. We followed a trail through the bushes where something had passed. Broken branches hanging at weird angles, patches of moss ripped from the ground, strange marks in the soft earth that looked like footprints but were too long, with too many weirdly spaced toes. "It's not hiding its tracks," I said quietly. Dad gave a single nod. "Wasn't hiding 28 years ago either." The implication hung between us. The creature wanted to be followed. It was leading us somewhere. As we moved deeper into the forest, it got darker. I clicked on my flashlight, keeping the beam low to avoid broadcasting our position too obviously. Dad did the same, moving his light back and forth across the ground ahead. The forest smelled exactly as I remembered: pine sap, decaying leaves, and the fresh scent of the nearby creek. Running these trails with Bandit, learning to track deer with Dad, that final hunt when everything changed. The years I'd spent in therapy trying to convince myself it had all been a childhood trauma response. A bear or wolf that fear turned into something monstrous felt hollow now. "There," Dad whispered, pointing ahead with the barrel of the Winchester. About 50 yards ahead stood the huge oak tree where he'd spotted the creature 3 nights ago. Even from here, I could see it was really old, with a trunk wider than Dad and me standing side by side, its branches stretching out against the darkening sky. We moved carefully, going from tree to tree for cover. The oak tree looked even bigger up close, its bark deeply cracked with age. Dad told me to go left while he went right, both of us moving toward the tree from different sides. As I came around the huge trunk, my flashlight beam showed something that made me freeze. Fresh cuts marked the bark, deep enough to show the pale wood underneath. They were in sets of 4, each mark about 2 inches wide, curving down like something had dug its claws in and pulled them down the trunk. Dad showed up on the other side, his flashlight showing similar marks on his side of the tree. Our eyes met, and I could tell he was thinking exactly what I was. "It wants us here," I said, the words barely audible. Dad nodded, raising the Winchester to his shoulder, looking at the branches overhead and the surrounding darkness. "Stay alert." I turned slowly, knife now drawn and held ready. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. Just our breathing. The attack came without warning. A rush of movement from above, a pale creature dropping from the branches super fast. Dad cried out as the creature landed on his back, knocking him to his knees. The Winchester hit the tree trunk but didn't fire. I didn't think. I reacted. 3 strides brought me to them. The creature was on top of Dad. I plunged the hunting knife into its side with all my strength. The blade sank in with surprising ease, not as tough as I expected. The creature let go of Dad right away, making a high-pitched, screeching noise as it turned toward me. Black fluid oozed from the wound. It stood up straight, taller than me by at least a foot. Its face turned toward mine. Its mouth opened, showing rows of jagged teeth. Dad scrambled for the Winchester, moving slower because he was hurt. The creature took a step toward me. I backed away, knife held in front of me. The Winchester fired with a loud bang. The creature jerked backward as the shot hit its chest. It staggered, but didn't fall, and made an even louder screech. Dad loaded another round, but before he could fire again, the creature dropped to all 4s and ran away really fast, disappearing into the bushes. Black droplets marked its path. "You okay?" I gasped, helping Dad to his feet. He nodded, face pale but determined. "We hit it, both of us." "It's bleeding," I said, pointing to the trail of black fluid. "We can track it." Dad checked the Winchester, making sure it was still functional after being dropped. "It's wounded. That makes it more dangerous. We can't let it get away. Not again." He met my eyes, and I could see a hint of pride on his face. Then he nodded once. "Stay behind me." We followed the trail of black fluid, walking carefully through the forest as it got darker. The droplets were easy to spot, shining wet in our flashlight beams. They took us deeper into the woods, away from any trails, through clusters of young pines and around massive boulders. About 20 minutes later, the trail led to a rocky ledge partly covered by thick brush. Black fluid marked a narrow opening between two big rocks. Looked like the entrance to a cave. "It went in there," I whispered. Dad raised the Winchester, aiming at the dark opening. "Could be its den." The thought of entering that darkness, of cornering the wounded creature in its own territory, made my mouth go dry. But we'd come too far to turn back now. "I'll go first," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Dad shook his head. "Together." We pushed aside the brush and got closer to the cave entrance. The smell hit us first, a sickly, sweet smell of rot that got stronger as we got near the opening. I pulled my shirt collar over my nose, but it didn't help much with the stink. Our flashlights only lit up a few feet ahead in the dark. The cave got wider past the entrance, with the ceiling about 7 feet high. Black fluid marked the stone floor, leading deeper inside. Dad and I looked at each other. We didn't need to say anything. We came to find evidence, and it was in there. We went in slowly, moving our flashlights across the rough stone walls. The cave went back about 30 feet before ending in a round chamber. When our lights showed the space, I stopped in my tracks, feeling sick. Bones, hundreds of them. Animal and human spread across the cave floor or stacked in corners. Some were clearly fresh, bits of flesh still stuck to them. Others were older, turned yellow with age. Skulls of deer and smaller animals mixed with what were definitely human remains. Leg bones, ribs, pieces of skulls. "My God," Dad breathed beside me. In the center of the cave was what looked like a nest. A dip in the floor lined with fabric that I realized with disgust were pieces of clothing. Torn shirts, pants, a child's jacket. And there, half buried among the bones and fabric, was a small sneaker, white with blue stripes, covered with dried mud. I knelt beside it, my flashlight showing writing on the rubber sole in black marker. "Peter Miller." "Call the police," Dad said, his voice tight. "Now." I pulled out my cell phone, surprised to find I had signal this deep in the woods. As I dialed 911, Dad kept the Winchester trained on the cave entrance, his body tense. 911, what's your emergency?" "My name is Thomas Wilson," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm with my father, Robert Wilson. We're in the woods off County Road 553, about 2 miles east of our property. We've found evidence related to the Peter Miller disappearance." The dispatcher's voice sharpened. "What kind of evidence, sir?" "His shoe, and human remains. We're in a cave. I can share my phone's location." "Please do that, sir. Are you in any immediate danger?" I looked at the black fluid trail leading deeper into the cave, disappearing into a crevice too small for us to follow. "I don't think so. Not right now. Officers are being dispatched to your location. Please stay on the line." Dad and I waited in that charnel house for 45 minutes, neither of us speaking much, both watching the cave entrance and the small crevice where the creature had disappeared. I wondered how far that passage went, whether it connected to other caves, other hunting grounds. When we finally heard voices calling from outside, Dad lowered the Winchester. 3 officers entered the cave cautiously, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Their professional demeanor cracked as they took in the scene, the bones, the clothing, the small sneaker with Peter Miller's name. One officer, older than the others, looked at Dad with new respect. "You were right," he said simply. Dad just nodded, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. The cave became a crime scene. More officers arrived, then forensic technicians. Dad and I were separated, questioned thoroughly about how we'd found the cave, what we'd seen. I told them everything except the nature of the creature, saying only that we'd tracked an animal we believed responsible for killing deer on our property. As dawn broke, we stood outside the cave watching the activity. Evidence bags were carried out one after another. A forensic technician confirmed what we already knew. The remains included those of a child matching Peter Miller's age and build. "What do you think happened to it?" I asked Dad quietly as we were finally allowed to leave. He looked toward the deeper woods, his face grim. It's still out there, wounded but alive. Will it come back? Dad's hand tightened on the Winchester. Maybe, but not soon. We walked home in silence as morning light came through the trees. The forest seemed different now, still dangerous, but no longer holding the same power over us. We had faced our terror together and survived again. At the edge of our property, Dad paused, looking back at the woods. "You were right to come back," he said. I nodded, understanding what he meant. Some things couldn't be outrun or forgotten. Some things had to be faced. We crossed the broken fence line together, returning to the cabin as the sun rose fully above the trees. I should have asked more questions. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Not because asking would have changed anything. I don't think it would have. But because I'm the sort of person who asks questions for a living, and I didn't ask a single one that mattered. The call came on a Wednesday in late October. A woman from the site coordination office in Ankara, English good enough that she didn't stumble, told me the epigrapher currently assigned to the Çatalhöyük dig had withdrawn due to a health matter, and that my name had been put forward as a replacement. She said the team needed someone with Neolithic symbolic systems experience, and that my publication record made me a strong fit. She said the position would begin in 10 days if I was available. She said all of this in the same tone you'd use to discuss a change in catering arrangements. I said yes. I didn't ask what kind of health matter. I didn't ask who had put my name forward. I didn't ask why the replacement timeline was 10 days instead of the start of the next field season, which would have been the sensible approach. I had 11 years at Durham, a decent stack of published work on pre-Neolithic Anatolian symbolic systems, and no particular reason to be suspicious of a phone call offering me a dig I'd have applied for anyway. So I said yes, I wrote down the logistics, and I started packing. That's my way of saying the story starts before I arrived. I just didn't know it yet. The Konya Plain in early November is the kind of flat that makes you feel slightly exposed, like the landscape is doing nothing to help you. I'd worked in Turkey before, a survey project near Göbekli Tepe in 2017, a documentation stint at a site outside Ankara before that. But the Central Plateau is its own thing. The sky sits very low and very gray, and the ground is hard and pale, and the two mounds at Çatalhöyük rise out of it like they've been waiting there longer than the surrounding country has any right to claim, which, depending on how you count, they have. The drive from Konya took just under an hour. The site driver, a quiet man who introduced himself only as Mehmet, didn't say much beyond asking once whether I'd been to the site before. I said no. He nodded and drove. The mounds appeared on the right side of the road before I expected them. Not dramatic, not the way a site looks in photographs. Just two low rises against the flat, the excavation shelters visible as dark shapes against the gray. I had my field jacket on already and my kit bag between my feet, and I was thinking about the level 12 eastern sections I'd been briefed on. The painted plaster documentation that apparently needed systematic UV survey. I was thinking about work. I wasn't thinking about anything else. The accommodation block was a low prefab structure set back from the main excavation area, functional in the way that field housing always is, meaning it worked and nothing more. Narrow corridors, doors with name slips in plastic holders, shared kitchen at the far end that smelled permanently of instant coffee and whatever someone had cooked 3 days prior. The site coordinator, a tired-looking woman named Berna, who managed logistics with the focused energy of someone who had been managing them for too long, walked me down the corridor and pointed out my room. Third door on the left. My name was already in the holder, printed on a slip of paper, slightly crooked. I dropped my bag, looked at the room, single bed, small desk, shelf above it, window facing the mound, and went back out to find the kitchen and introduce myself to whoever was around. There were 4 other team members in that week, plus Lloyd, who I hadn't met yet. a geophysics postdoc from Utrecht named Peter, who talked quickly and ate standing up, 2 excavation specialists from Istanbul whose names I got wrong twice before they stuck, a finds coordinator from Edinburgh called Sandra, who'd been at the site 3 seasons and who gave me the kind of look that means she'd seen replacements come through before and had learned not to invest early. Fair enough, I asked, because it seemed natural to ask, whether Garrett had left anything useful, notes, a preliminary symbol catalog, anything that would help me pick up where he'd left off. Sandra set down her mug. "There wasn't much to leave," she said. "He wasn't here long." "How long?" She thought about it. 3 weeks, maybe. He got sick. It was quick. I said something like that was a shame and asked if his notes had been filed anywhere accessible. She said she didn't think so, and the conversation moved on, and I let it move on because I had no reason not to. It was 2 days later that I noticed it. Not deliberately. I wasn't looking. I was trying to find the linen cupboard, which Berna had mentioned was at the far end of the corridor past the last room, and I walked the full length of it reading the name slips out of mild curiosity the way you do when you're new somewhere and still mapping the place. Peter van der Berg, Sandra Holt, Kemal Arslan, Deniz Yıldız. My own name, slightly crooked, and then the linen cupboard. I stood there for a moment, counted back, 5 names, including mine. 5 rooms occupied. The corridor had 8 doors. I went back and looked at the 3 that had no slips in their holders. One of them had a small square of discoloration on the door where a holder had been removed, the paint slightly brighter in a rectangle the size of a name card, the way paint looks when something's been taken off a wall that had been there long enough to matter. The shelf inside, when I opened the door, was clean. Not dusty clean. Wiped clean. The bed was stripped to the mattress, and the mattress had no indentation, no compression, nothing that said a person had slept on it for 3 weeks. I closed the door and went and found the linen cupboard and stood in front of it for longer than I needed to. 3 weeks. Garrett had been here 3 weeks. There should have been something. A forgotten adapter, a book, a coffee ring on the desk, the kind of residue a person leaves without meaning to. There was nothing. Not even the absence of things. The room had been returned to a state that said no one had ever been assigned to it at all. I filed it away. That's what I did. I noted it the way I note an anomalous symbol, cataloged it, set it aside, kept moving. It didn't fit the explanation I'd been given, but I didn't have enough to build anything from it yet, and I had work to start and a team to get to know and a UV survey to plan. So I filed it and said nothing. Looking back, that was the first thing I should have pulled on. I didn't. The briefing happened on Friday morning, the end of my first week. Lloyd ran them in the main site office, a larger prefab with maps on every wall and a long table that was never quite big enough for everyone. I'd met him by then, briefly. He was the kind of man who fills a room without trying, tall and broad and carrying that particular brand of authority that comes from decades of being the most senior person in any given space. He'd introduced himself with his full title, Dr. Lee Lloyd, Stanford, and shaken my hand with the grip of someone who had shaken a great many hands and knew it. The briefing was routine. Excavation progress on the southern mound, geophysics updates from Peter, a discussion about the Level 12 eastern sections that confirmed I'd be starting UV documentation the following Monday. I was taking notes. The room smelled like coffee and damp canvas. Quinn arrived 8 minutes late. I hadn't been introduced to her yet. She came in without apologizing for the interruption, set a clipboard on the table, and waited for Lloyd to pause. He didn't pause. She waited another moment and then spoke anyway. "I need to flag a ministry requirement before we go further," she said. Her English was precise, slightly formal in the way that second language fluency sometimes is. All personal electronic devices, phones, tablets, recording equipment, must be registered with the ministry's site log before entering any excavation chamber. This is effective immediately. Lloyd looked at her the way you look at a noise that hasn't stopped. Gale, he said. We've discussed the registration protocols. The team is compliant. The requirement has been updated, she said. Registration before each entry, not at the start of the season. That's not practical. It's a ministry requirement. Lloyd held her gaze for a moment, then turned back to the table. We'll address the logistics separately. Moving on. And he moved on, and the briefing continued, and that was that. I wrote it down. Device registration, ministry, Quinn. And then I turned the page and wrote notes about the UV survey and forgot about it entirely. 2 details, neither connected, both already pointing at something I wasn't ready to see. The eastern wall of level 12 smelled like chalk and old water. That's the first thing I remember about it. Not the discovery, not what came after, just that smell. Chalk and cold water and something underneath both of them that I never quite identified. Mineral. Ancient. The kind of smell that doesn't have a name because nobody's needed one. I'd been assigned the plaster survey as standard documentation work. Nothing exciting about it. You photograph the wall surface in sections, log the condition of the plaster, note any pigment degradation or structural cracking, move to the next section. I'd done it 100 times at a dozen sites. The UV lamp was just part of the kit. You run it across the surface because sometimes pigment that's invisible in natural light shows up under ultraviolet, faded ochre, or lime wash that the eye misses. Most of the time you get nothing. Sometimes you get a faint geometric border or a handprint the visible light survey missed. Useful, but not dramatic. I was working the 3rd section from the north end, maybe 1.5 meters above the floor. My knees were already sore from crouching. The lamp was in my left hand, the camera hanging from my neck, and I was doing the thing you do after a few hours of documentation work, where your brain goes slightly elsewhere and your hands just carry on. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. That's probably why I caught it. The UV light picked up something in the lower section of the wall, just above the floor line. Not pigment, not a surface marking. Something below the surface, a shadow almost, but sharp-edged in a way that shadows aren't. I stopped moving the lamp and held it steady and leaned in. Carved lines, angular. Running in columns, tight and regular, descending from about 40 centimeters above the floor, straight down to the floor itself. And this is the part that took me a moment to process. Continuing below it. The columns didn't stop at the level 12 floor. They kept going. The site maps showed solid substrate below that level. Not a chamber, not a continuation of the occupation layer. Solid. These symbols were carved into something that was supposed to be nothing. I put the camera up and took the first photograph without really deciding to. Then I took 12 more. Here's the thing about working in Neolithic iconography for as long as I had. You build a vocabulary. Not just from Çatalhöyük, from every comparable site across the Anatolian Plateau, from Göbekli Tepe, from Nevali Chori, from a dozen smaller sites that never made the popular press. 40 years of documented material, give or take, and I'd cataloged most of it in one form or another. Geometric symbols, anthropomorphic figures, hunting scenes, the particular way a certain type of chevron appears and reappears across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers and thousands of years. You know this vocabulary the way you know the streets of a city you've lived in a long time. You might not be able to name every alley, but you know when you're somewhere you've never been. I had never been anywhere near these symbols. The angular forms were consistent. Not random, not decorative in the way you'd expect from surface ornamentation. They had the look of something that meant something specific, the kind of density you see in functional inscription rather than symbolic decoration. The columns were regular enough that I counted them, 7 across the visible section, each one descending with the same spacing, the same character height, the same depth of cut. Whoever had carved these had done it carefully, with intention, over a long time, or with considerable practice. Maybe both. I spent another 40 minutes with the lamp, working the floor line, trying to see how far down the columns went. I couldn't tell. The floor itself was solid, and without breaking through it, I couldn't follow the inscription further. I photographed everything I could reach. Then I packed up the kit, walked back to the accommodation block, and sat on the edge of my bed for a while without taking my jacket off. I brought the photographs to Lloyd the next morning, printed, because I wanted him to see them at actual size rather than on a screen he could minimize. His office was the largest room in the site's administrative section, which still wasn't large. A desk, 2 chairs, a shelf of binders, a wall map of the excavation grid with color-coded pins. Lloyd was already at his desk when I knocked. He was the kind of man who was always already at his desk, which I'd taken as a mark of professionalism but was starting to think might just be a way of controlling who came to him versus who he went to. I laid the photographs out in sequence. 3 rows, left to right, showing the full section from the north end of the wall down to the floor line and the continuation below. I explained what I'd found, where, and how. UV survey, lower wall section, the symbols running below the level 12 floor into substrate that the site maps showed as solid. I kept it factual. I'd been careful with the framing of the prints to show the floor line clearly so he could see the columns continuing through it. Lloyd looked at the photographs for a long time, not in the way you look at something that surprises you, not leaning forward, not asking questions, not reaching for one to look more closely. He stood still and looked at them the way you look at something you already know is there but were hoping not to see confirmed. That's the only way I can describe it. His hands were flat on the desk and he didn't move them. He didn't say anything for long enough that I started to feel like I should say something to fill it. I didn't. I'd spent 11 years in academic departments. I knew the difference between someone thinking and someone deciding. Eventually he said, "Where exactly in the eastern wall?" I told him. 3rd section from the north, lower register, specific grid coordinates. He nodded once, slowly. "I'll have someone look at the structural condition of that section." That was it. That was the whole response. I gathered the photographs. He didn't ask to keep them, which told me something on its own. I walked back out into the corridor and stood there for a moment in the cold, which was always there. The site never really warmed up in November, and I thought, well, I didn't think anything coherent. I just stood there. The next morning, Lloyd announced at the briefing that the eastern wall section of level 12 was showing signs of structural instability and that access was suspended pending a safety survey. He said it the same way he said everything, with the flat authority of someone who doesn't expect to be questioned. Nobody questioned him. The survey would be scheduled, he said, once the engineering team had assessed the timeline. I waited a week. No survey was scheduled. I asked one of the site assistants, casually, whether she'd heard anything about the level 12 safety assessment. She hadn't. I asked again after another few days. Different person. Same answer. The thing about suppression, and I want to be clear that I'm calling it that, not caution or protocol or administrative delay. The thing about suppression is that it only makes sense as a response if you already know what you're suppressing. Curiosity doesn't close a wall section. Uncertainty doesn't close a wall section. What closes a wall section is knowing what's behind it and deciding nobody else should get there. Lloyd had looked at those photographs and recognized something, not with surprise, with the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting for that thing to surface and had already decided what he would do when it did. I still had the photographs. I'd kept copies, printed and digital both, which I don't think Lloyd had considered because he hadn't asked for them and hadn't told me to delete anything. Maybe he assumed I would. Maybe he assumed the closed wall and the absent survey would be enough. The symbols were still down there. The columns still ran below the level 12 floor into substrate the map said was solid. Whatever was below that floor, whatever those symbols were carved into, whatever they were carved for, it hadn't gone anywhere just because Lloyd had put a closure notice on the wall section. I knew I was going back. I think I'd known it since I was standing in that corridor outside his office. I just needed a few more days to admit it to myself and work out when. Thursday evening. The site quieted early on Thursdays. I'd noticed that in the first week without thinking much of it. The kind of thing you file away without knowing why. Thursday evening then. Thursday came around and I went. That's not quite right. I didn't just go, like I'd decided on a whim. I'd spent 3 days working up to it, telling myself I was being careful when really I was just scared and needed the time to get past it. I'd watched the site pattern. I'd checked which evenings the accommodation block emptied out, and when the last of the dig staff usually drifted toward the mess tent. Thursdays, the way I'd clocked it in that first week, the site went quiet early. No particular reason I ever worked out. Just one of those rhythms a place develops. By 7, the paths between the excavation zones were empty. The portable lights in the western trenches switched off, and the only movement was usually Quinn doing her last equipment check of the week, which kept her in the storage annex off the main compound for the better part of an hour. I knew all of that. I'd been paying attention without meaning to, the way you do when something's bothering you, and your brain won't leave it alone. I went at 7:30. Headlamp, UV lamp, my field notebook, and my phone. I told myself the notebook was professional habit. Really, it was because I didn't entirely trust the phone anymore, not after what had happened in Lloyd's office. That look he'd given the photographs, long and careful and completely still, the look of a man reading something he already knew the ending to. The eastern wall section had a closure notice taped to the wooden barrier they'd put across the passage entrance. Yellow paper, Lloyd's signature at the bottom. Structural assessment pending. I stood there for a moment looking at it. Then I ducked under the barrier and kept walking. The UV lamp picked up the symbols immediately. They were exactly where I'd left them. Of course they were. I don't know what I expected. They'd been there for however long they'd been there. They weren't going anywhere on my account. But there was still something that loosened in my chest when the lamp caught the first column and the angular lines came up sharp and clear against the plaster. Still there, still real. I hadn't imagined it. I followed them down. The columns ran to the floor the same as before, but I got lower this time, crouched right down with the UV lamp angled into the seam where the wall met the level 12 floor, and that's when I saw the gap. Not a crack. A gap, maybe 40 centimeters across, where the floor substrate had either broken away or, and this is the thing I kept coming back to later, had never been filled in. The symbols continued through it, down into the dark below. I lay flat on the floor of the passage with my headlamp pointing into the gap and looked. There was a chamber below. I don't have a clean way to describe what it felt like to see that, so I won't try. I just lay there for a moment with my cheek against the cold floor and looked at the top edge of a carved wall maybe 1.5 meters below me. And then I found the handholds. There were handholds, worn smooth, cut into the substrate at the edge of the gap, which I noticed and then immediately stopped thinking about because thinking about it meant thinking about who had cut them and when and how many times they'd been used. And I went down. 4 meters, give or take. I measured it after by the length of rope I'd have needed, working it out in my head on the way back up. 4 meters below level 12's floor, which put me somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years before the Neolithic occupation above me. That's not a number that means much until you're standing in it. Then it means everything. The chamber was roughly 8 meters across, irregular shape, low ceiling that came down toward the far wall. And the walls, floor to ceiling, every surface I could reach with the lamp. The same angular symbols in the same tight columns, but denser here, packed closer, running in directions that didn't follow the vertical the way the level 12 carvings had. Some of the columns curved. Some intersected. I stood in the middle of it and turned slowly with the UV lamp, and I genuinely could not find a section of wall that hadn't been worked. I wrote Chamber 7 North in my notebook, gave it a designation the way I would any excavation context, because that's what my training told me to do when everything else my training had prepared me for had just stopped applying. At the center of the chamber was a stone platform, roughly knee-height, maybe 1.5 meters long natural rock that had been shaped, not carved into anything representational, just leveled and worked smooth on the upper surface. And in the surface, 2 grooves, parallel, curved, each one about the width of a wrist. They were worn. Not cut-worn, not tool-worn. Worn the way a wooden step gets worn when enough people have used it for long enough. That organic smoothing that happens when something soft moves against something hard over an enormous amount of time. I put my own wrist in one of the grooves. It fit. I took it out again fairly quickly. I wrote down the dimensions. I wrote down the groove spacing. I kept writing because it was the only thing that felt like solid ground. Then I heard it. Low. Below what you'd call a sound, almost. More like something your chest registers before your ears do. I stood still and waited, and it came again. 4 beats, evenly spaced, and then silence. I counted the silence. 11 seconds. Then 4 beats again. It was coming from a fissure in the bedrock at the far end of the chamber, a vertical crack maybe 10 centimeters wide running floor to ceiling. I crossed to it and held my hand near the opening and felt nothing. No air movement, no temperature differential, just the pulse, regular and low, somewhere below 80 hertz, if I had to put a number on it. I've been near enough geological phenomena in fieldwork to know what ground settling sounds like, what water through limestone sounds like, what gas seepage sounds like. This wasn't any of those. The spacing was too consistent. 4 beats, 11 seconds, 4 beats, 11 seconds. Not varying by more than a fraction across the time I stood there. I got my phone out and opened the audio recorder. I recorded 17 seconds. I know it was 17 because I watched the counter. Then the screen went dark. I pressed the side button. Nothing. I held it. Nothing. The battery indicator had shown 64% when I'd come down through the gap. I'd checked it specifically because I'd wanted to know how long I had for photographs. 64% doesn't die in 17 seconds. It doesn't die in 17 minutes under normal use. I stood in the dark with a dead phone and a UV lamp and a notebook, and the pulse kept coming. 4 beats, silence, 4 beats. And I made myself breathe steadily and think about what I needed to do next. I photographed what I could with the UV lamp held close to the wall sections, using the lamp itself to light the frame since the phone was gone. Not ideal. Not nothing. I filled 6 pages of the notebook. Symbol tracings, rough dimensions, the groove measurements, a sketch of the chamber layout, a note about the fissure location and the pulse interval. I wrote the number 11 in the margin and circled it 3 times, which isn't something I usually do, but I wanted to remember exactly how certain I'd been about the count. Then I went back up through the gap, under the barrier, out through the passage, and across the empty site to the accommodation block. I sat on my bunk for a while with the dead phone in my hand. The UV lamp was on the floor. My notebook was open on my knee. I'd found a chamber that didn't exist on any official map, sitting in a stratum that predated everything above it by a margin that rewrote the timeline of human presence at this site, at any site in this region, if I was being honest about what the depth implied. The walls were covered in a symbol system I couldn't identify. The platform at the center had been used repeatedly by something with wrists, and in the bedrock, something was still producing a rhythmic pulse at 11-second intervals, regular enough to set a watch by, and it had drained my phone battery in 17 seconds flat. I turned the phone over in my hands. The screen stayed dark. Whatever was down there, it wasn't finished. The week after I found Chamber 7 North, I tried to be methodical about it. That's my way of saying I tried to pretend I was doing normal work while doing something that was very much not normal work. I had the photographs on my phone. The phone I'd charged back to full overnight, which took it no problem, as if nothing had happened. And I had my notebook. And I had the site's academic database, which was a shared terminal system the team used for cross-referencing iconographic finds against the published Çatalhöyük record. 11 years of cataloged material, plus access to the wider J.S. Tor archaeology archive. It should have been enough to at least narrow things down. I started with the basic angular forms. Not the full symbol combination, just the individual components, the hooked verticals, the repeating tripartite clusters, the thing that looked almost like a glyph but wasn't quite any glyph I'd encountered. I ran them separately, got results that were thin but plausible. Geometric incision patterns from level 5, a couple of parallels from Göbekli Tepe's enclosure D. Nothing that matched, but nothing that shut the door either. I wrote down the reference numbers and kept going. Then I tried the combination, the full repeating sequence as it appeared in the columns, the way the symbols stacked and related to each other, the spacing ratios, the directional logic of how they descended. I entered the search parameters, hit the query button, and the system logged me out. Not an error message, not a timeout, just logged out. Back to the login screen, clean and immediate, as if I'd never been in. I logged back in, pulled up the query form again, adjusted the parameters slightly, dropped one symbol from the combination, changed the regional filter, ran it, logged out again. I sat there for a minute. The terminal room was empty. It was mid-morning. Most of the team was in the field, and the room had that particular quiet of a place that's usually occupied. Someone had left a mug on the shelf above the terminal. There was a crack in the plaster above the window that I'd been meaning to note for the maintenance log. I tried 4 more variations over the next 20 minutes. Each one, any query that included the core repeating sequence from Chamber 7 North, produced the same result: instant logout. The system didn't freeze, didn't throw an error, didn't give me anything to work with. It just removed me from the session the moment I asked the right question. I could have told myself it was a glitch, a corrupted search index, some kind of database conflict with unusual character combinations. I'm an academic. I know how to talk myself into a mundane explanation when a mundane explanation is available. But I'd run 40-odd queries that week on everything from pigment analysis to wall plaster composition, and not one of them had logged me out. Only the symbols did that. Only the specific combination from the chamber walls. I closed the terminal and went back to my room. The photographs were still on my phone. I'd been careful not to sync them to anything site-connected, but I had a Durham library account. Everyone at the department did. It gave you remote access to the institutional image archive for comparative work. The idea was straightforward. Upload the images to the archive, flag them as a research query, let the library's system run them against the iconographic databases I couldn't access from here. Durham's system was broader than the site's, and it was 3,000 kilometers away from whatever was happening to the site database. I uploaded 37 photographs. The clearest ones, the full wall sections, the close detail of the symbol columns, 2 comparison shots showing the relationship between the level 12 carvings and the Chamber 7 North inscriptions. I flagged the upload as a symbol identification query and wrote a brief covering note. Standard procedure. I'd done it a dozen times for routine fieldwork. 2 hours later, my phone rang. The number was a Durham landline. I answered it standing outside the accommodation block, which I'd walked to for no particular reason except that I didn't want to be inside when I took the call. "Is this Dr. Jacobs?" The voice was clear, professional, a Southern English accent. "This is Judy Mills from the Durham University Library. I'm calling about an image upload you made to the institutional archive this morning." I said yes, that was me. "Right. So, I'm sorry to bother you, I know you're in the field, but the files you uploaded have been flagged by our IT security system. Automatically, I mean it's not something I did manually." She sounded slightly apologetic about this, the way people do when they're delivering news they don't fully understand. I'm not entirely sure what triggered it, but the system flagged the images as restricted content, and I've been asked to let you know that you should contact your department chair before doing anything further with the files. I asked her what restricted content meant, specifically? Honestly, I don't know, she said. The flag just says to direct you to your department chair. That's really all I have. I'm sorry I can't tell you more. I thanked her and ended the call. I stood outside for a while after that. The plain was flat and gray to the south, the mounds low against the sky. 2 hours. From upload to phone call, 2 hours. Whatever the flag was, it wasn't a slow, bureaucratic process. It was fast, and it was already in place before I'd sent anything, which meant the system hadn't flagged the images because someone reviewed them. It had flagged them because something in the images matched a pre-existing parameter. A pre-existing parameter that somebody, at some point, had set up to catch exactly this kind of content. I did not contact my department chair. Derek Woods had published one paper that mattered to me. 1998, Journal of Near Eastern Studies, a comparative analysis of pre-ceramic symbolic systems in central Anatolia. It was a narrow piece of work, not widely cited, and he'd retired from Bologna a few years after publishing it. That was exactly why I wanted him. He had no active institutional position, no grant funding to protect, no department politics to navigate. He was 74 years old and living in retirement, and if he'd published on pre-Neolithic Anatolian symbols in 1998, he'd spent time thinking about the same stratum I was looking at now. I found his email through a faculty emeritus listing that was 3 years out of date, which meant there was a reasonable chance it still worked. I wrote him a careful message, brief, specific, no speculation. I described the symbol set, included 6 of the clearest photographs as attachments, gave him the approximate depth and the stratum context, and asked if he could identify the system or point me toward anything comparable in the published record. I sent it at 2:30 in the afternoon. His reply came at 8:20 that evening. I was in the common room, not reading anything, just sitting there with a cup of tea that had gone cold. My phone buzzed, and I looked at it, and there it was. The message was 4 sentences. Delete the photographs. Do not return to the chamber. I cannot explain further. Please understand that I am not being careless with this. That was it. No analysis, no identification, no reference to anything in the published record, no explanation of what he recognized or why it mattered. Just delete, don't go back, I can't say more. I read it probably 6 times. The thing that kept snagging me wasn't the warning itself. It was the last line. Please understand that I am not being careless with this. That's not how you write to a stranger you think is overreacting. That's how you write to someone you believe, someone whose situation you recognize, when you want them to know the warning is serious without being able to say why. He'd seen the photographs, and he'd written back in 6 hours, and he'd told me nothing except to stop. I called Bologna's retired faculty directory the next morning. It rang 4 times, and a woman answered. Administrative voice, accented English, the kind of tone that means she'd answered the same line 1,000 times. Sky Davidson, Faculty Services. I asked if she could confirm contact details for Professor Emeritus Derek Woods, that I'd been corresponding with him and wanted to follow up. There was a brief pause. I'm sorry, she said. Professor Woods he's not available. He was admitted to hospital 2 days ago. He suffered a stroke. I said I was sorry to hear that. Yes, she said. Is there anything else I can help you with? There wasn't. I put the phone down and sat with it. 2 days ago, Woods had received my photographs, written 4 sentences telling me to stop, and 2 days before that, before I'd even sent the message, he'd had a stroke, or he'd sent the message and then had a stroke. The timing was close enough that I couldn't be certain which way it ran, and I wasn't sure it mattered. What I kept coming back to was Garrett. No room in the accommodation block, no cleared shelf, no stripped bed. A man who had been here before me, working the same site, and who had been removed from the physical record so completely that I'd only noticed because I was looking for the absence. Garrett had been the epigrapher on site before me. He'd been here in this position with access to level 12. And then he was gone, and his name was gone with him. And nobody elaborated on the health matter that had taken him away. Woods had seen the photographs and told me to stop, and then ended up in hospital. Every channel I'd tried, the site database, Durham's library system, Woods, had closed within hours. Not slowly. Not through the usual friction of bureaucracy and delay. Fast and clean, and in ways that left me with nothing to work with. I didn't know what had happened to Garrett, but I was starting to think I needed to find out. Cambridge's staff portal wasn't difficult to get into. That's not a brag. It's just that academic institutions run on the assumption that nobody outside the department has any reason to go looking, so the barriers are low. Staff directory, departmental listings, emergency contacts on the faculty profile page. Garrett's was still live. Nobody had thought to take it down, or maybe nobody had thought it mattered. Either way, it was there. Patricia Garrett, Bristol, a mobile number. I sat with the number for about 10 minutes before I called. I didn't know what I was going to say. I still don't know if there was a good version of that call. A way to ring up a stranger and ask about her brother without it sounding like exactly what it was, which was someone who'd been following his footprints into a hole in the ground and wanted to know what had happened to him. She picked up on the third ring. I told her I was an epigrapher at Çatalhöyük, that I'd taken over from her brother in November, and that I was trying to reach him because I'd come across some of his earlier notation work and had a few questions. That was the version I'd settled on. Plausible enough. Not entirely a lie. I had come across his work in a manner of speaking. There was a pause on her end. Not a long one. More like someone who's had to explain something painful enough times that they've found the efficient route through it. "Bernard's not reachable," she said. "He's been in a facility in Oxfordshire since October, private care." I asked if it was a medical matter, which was a stupid question, but I needed her to keep talking. "He stopped being coherent," she said. The word came out carefully, like she'd chosen it specifically because it was accurate without being the worst possible way to say it. "He's not in distress. They tell me he's calm. But he doesn't respond to anything. He doesn't seem to register that anyone's there." I asked what he did do. Another stupid question, maybe, but she answered it. "He talks," she said. "Not to anyone. Not about anything. Just the same thing over and over. 4 sounds. Syllables, I suppose. And then he stops, and then again. They told me it was every 11 seconds. They timed it." I was sitting at the small desk in my room with a notepad in front of me that I hadn't written anything on. I put the pen down. Patricia kept talking for a while after that. The facility, the doctors, the fact that nobody had given her an explanation she could actually use. I listened. I said the things you say. I didn't tell her what I knew, which was that her brother had been in a chamber 4 meters below the current excavation floor and had heard a fissure in the bedrock produce a 4-beat pulse every 11 seconds, and that something in that chamber had followed him out. I didn't tell her that because I couldn't see what it would do for her. Some information doesn't help the person you give it to. It just transfers the weight. I thanked her and ended the call and sat there for a while. 4 beats, 11 seconds. Garrett had been in Chamber 7 North, and the chamber had done something to him that a private facility in Oxfordshire hadn't been able to reverse in 6 weeks. Woods had seen the photographs and ended up in hospital. The pattern wasn't subtle anymore. It was the same shape, twice, with different men, and I was the third epigrapher looking at the same symbols. The thing I kept coming back to was the USB drive. I had the photographs on it, the audio, my partial translation notes. If someone found it, Lloyd Quinn, a maintenance worker who happened to look in the wrong drawer, it was gone, and I was gone with it, and the chamber stayed buried, The longer I waited, the more that risk compounded, and there was something else, something I couldn't quite articulate at the time, but that kept pressing at the back of everything. Whatever was in that fissure wasn't static. It had been there for 15 to 20,000 years, but it wasn't just sitting. It was doing something. And I didn't know how long I had before the doing something changed in a way I couldn't document. So I went back, twice more in the following days, working fast and quiet and without telling anyone. I photographed everything I could reach, every wall panel, every column of symbols, the platform at the center, the fissure itself, the floor where the symbols continued beneath the sediment line. 340 images across all 3 visits, including the first. I cross-referenced angles where I could, photographed the same panels under different lighting conditions, used my UV lamp until the battery was low enough that I didn't trust it anymore. The pulse was still running. 4 beats, silence. 4 beats. But the interval had changed. On my second return visit, I counted it manually, sitting in the chamber with my back against the far wall and my phone open to a stopwatch. 11 seconds between sequences, same as before. But on the third visit, 4 days later, I counted 9. I did it a dozen times, 9 seconds, consistent. I sat there counting it over and over until I was sure I hadn't miscounted the first time, and then I sat there a while longer because I wasn't sure what to do with that. Something in the fissure was accelerating. That's the plain version. I didn't have a framework for what that meant, and I still don't, not really. But it meant the chamber wasn't just old, it was active. It was changing. And I was the only person documenting it who wasn't actively trying to keep it buried. The fourth visit was when I found out I was wrong about that last part. I came in through the level 12 gap the same way I always had, moved down into Chamber 7 North, and was crossing toward the eastern wall when I heard something from the connecting passage. The narrow cut between 7 North and the adjacent chamber, the site maps called 6 South. Footsteps. Measured, unhurried. Someone who knew where they were going. I pressed back against the wall and stayed still. Quinn came through the passage and moved directly into 6 South without pausing. She had a UV filter attachment on her camera, the kind you have to order specifically, not standard issue for the site kit, and she went straight to the eastern inscription panels, not scanning, not exploring, but moving to specific sections the way you move to a page you've already bookmarked. She photographed them in sequence. She knew the order. She knew which panels had what she needed. I watched her work for probably 6 or 7 minutes. She didn't hesitate once. Then she crossed the threshold into 7 North. The team had a boundary line, informal, no tape or marker, just an understanding that the northern chamber complex was off limits pending structural assessment. Lloyd had said it twice in briefings. Quinn had been present for both. She stepped over it without breaking stride and moved to the central platform, crouched down, and photographed the worn grooves from 3 angles. Then she stood and looked at the fissure for a moment, not photographing it, just looking. And then she left the same way she'd come in. I stayed against the wall until I couldn't hear her anymore. The device registration rule. That was the thing that landed. Quinn had stood up in a briefing in the first week and told us all to log our personal electronics with the ministry before entering any excavation chamber. Lloyd had called it bureaucratic overcaution, and everyone had moved on. I'd noted it and filed it. But standing in Chamber 7 North with Quinn's footsteps fading up through the passage, I understood what it had actually been. Not a monitoring protocol for what the team might find. A monitoring protocol for how close the team was getting to something the ministry already knew was there. Every equipment inspection that had stopped a dig day short. Every paperwork dispute that had redirected work away from the northern mound. The rerouted schedules, the delayed supply approvals, the 3 separate occasions when a Lloyd-directed trench had been halted, for reasons that never quite resolved. I'd logged all of it as the usual friction between a foreign academic team and a host country bureaucracy. It wasn't. It was interference. and it had been running the whole time, and Quinn had been the instrument of it, and the ministry had known about Chamber 7 North before any of us arrived. Garrett hadn't stumbled onto something new. He'd gotten too close to something that was already being managed. I stood in the chamber for a while after she left. The pulse ran through its cycle. 4 beats, silence, 9 seconds, then again. The satellite terminal had been there the whole time. That's the thing that gets me, even now. I'd walked past the field office every day for 3 weeks, past the little antenna mount on the roof, past the laminated sign on the door that said British Institute at Ankara, Site Operations. I'd noted it the way you note a fire extinguisher. Background. Infrastructure. Not mine to use. I sat in my room after Quinn left the chamber and worked through it properly for the first time. Every channel I'd tried had collapsed within hours. The site database logged me out. Durham's IT flagged the images. Woods had a stroke. The pattern wasn't coincidence, and it wasn't bad luck. It was a system, and the system was monitoring anything that moved through institutional networks. Email, library uploads, academic databases. Quinn couldn't watch what she couldn't see coming, but she didn't need to. The networks did it for her. Whatever arrangement the ministry had with those systems, it was upstream of anything I could root around, except the Iridium terminal. That was the thing. The British Institute had installed it for geological survey data. Atmospheric readings, seismic monitoring, the kind of low-bandwidth transmission that nobody in Ankara would have thought to route through a ministry-adjacent filter because nobody in Ankara thought an epigrapher would be using it to send 340 photographs of a pre-Neolithic chamber at 2 a.m. I sat with that for a while. Not long, maybe 20 minutes. Then I started compressing files. The field office was a prefab unit at the eastern edge of the accommodation block, maybe 30 meters from my room. I'd been inside twice, once for a site orientation in my first week, once to sign a form about generator usage. The terminal sat on a metal desk in the back corner, a boxy unit with a coiled handset and a small screen showing a steady green uplink indicator. The desk had a laminated instruction sheet taped above it and a USB port on the side panel that I'd noticed during the orientation without registering why I'd noticed it. I noticed things like that. Occupational habit, I suppose. You spend 11 years cataloging objects, and you start treating the world like a site grid. Everything gets logged, most of it filed under not currently relevant. The terminal had been sitting in that category for 3 weeks. I crossed the site at 1:53 in the morning. No torch. I'd walked that path enough times that I didn't need one, and a light moving across the site at that hour would have been visible from the accommodation block windows. The sky was clear, and the plain was flat, and the cold had that specific quality it gets out there in November. Not wet, but absolute. The kind that settles into your joints before you've gone 20 meters. I had the USB drive in my jacket pocket. I had a list of 3 email addresses in my head that I'd memorized and then deleted from my phone. The field office door had a standard PIN code lock. I'd watched Lloyd enter it twice, and the code hadn't changed. I'm not going to write the code down here. Doesn't matter now anyway. Inside, I didn't turn on the overhead light. There was a desk lamp near the terminal that threw a small circle and nothing else, and I used that. The uplink indicator was still green. I connected the drive, opened the transmission interface, and sat for a moment looking at the screen. I want to be honest about what I was thinking right then. Not the version where I'd worked it all through and made peace with the consequences. The actual version. I was thinking about Garrett in that facility in Oxfordshire, repeating 4 syllables every 9 seconds, and about Woods in a hospital in Bologna, and about the fact that whatever was in that fissure had been accelerating across my 3 visits and was still accelerating now. I was thinking that the sealed professional answer, go to the authorities, follow the proper channels, trust the institution, had already been tried by at least 2 people before me, and had ended in a hospital room and a locked ward. I was thinking that the USB drive in the port was the only complete record of what I'd found, and that if I walked out of that office without transmitting it, the drive would be found within the week, and the chamber would be quietly managed, and in 6 months there would be no door with my name on it in the accommodation block either. That's my way of saying I wasn't brave about it. I was just out of other options. Teresa Nunez at Hurriyet. I'd found her through a byline search on pre-Neolithic Anatolian coverage, 3 articles in the past 2 years, one of them a piece on ministry interference with a dig site near Göbekli Tepe that had been published and then quietly delisted from the paper's archive. She was 31, based in Istanbul, and she'd already been somewhere close to this story once. That mattered. Kevin Fields at Durham was my department chair, careful, collegial, the kind of man who forwarded things to colleagues before he'd finished reading them. That also mattered, though for different reasons. The archaeology forum was a long shot, the kind of upload that could sit unread for a week or get reposted across a dozen servers by morning. I didn't know which. I sent it anyway. The compressed archive was 412 megabytes, photographs, audio file, partial translation of the level 14 inscriptions, coordinates for Chamber 7 North. I added a plaintext document, 3 paragraphs, no more, explaining what the photographs were, where they came from, and what the audio recording contained. I didn't editorialize. I just said what I'd found and where it was, and that the interval between pulses had shortened across 3 visits from 11 seconds to 9. The transmission took 6 minutes and 40 seconds. I watched the progress bar and didn't move. The terminal made a faint cycling sound, a low electronic hum that rose and fell with the data packets. I'd heard that sound before on geological survey nights and never paid it any attention. I paid attention now. When the screen showed transmission complete, all recipients confirmed, I sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then I disconnected the drive, put it in my pocket, and turned off the desk lamp. I had the door open when I heard the vehicles. 2 of them, coming from the Konya Road. No sirens, but they weren't running quiet either. The engines were moving at pace, and the headlights swept the far edge of the site before I'd taken 3 steps out of the office. I stopped, thought about running. Didn't. There was nowhere on the Konya plain to run to at 2 in the morning that wasn't just more plain. I stood at the field office door and waited. They were security personnel, not police. Different insignia, Ministry of Culture markings on the vehicles. 4 of them. One spoke enough English to tell me not to move, which I wasn't doing. Another went straight past me into the field office. I heard him at the terminal for maybe 30 seconds. Then he came back out and said something in Turkish to the one who spoke English. The English speaker held out his hand. I gave him the drive. He looked at it for a moment, then put it in an evidence bag. Very procedural about it. I remember thinking that was almost worse than if they'd been rough. The efficiency of it, the practiced quality. Like this was a thing they'd done before and expected to do again. Teresa Nunez published the article at 7:18 that morning. I know the time because one of the ministry officials who came to take my statement had a phone that buzzed on the table between us, and when he looked at it, his expression changed in a specific way. Not alarmed exactly. More like someone who'd been told a pipe had burst and was now calculating the damage. He excused himself. When he came back, he was on a call in Turkish and stayed on it for 11 minutes by the clock on the wall. The article had the photographs. It had a description of the audio recording and a transcription of the 4-beat sequence. It had the coordinates of Chamber 7 North and a note about the pulse interval shortening. I don't know how she turned it around that fast. She must have been awake when the transmission came in, or she woke up and saw it and understood immediately what she had. Either way, she ran it. The suppression order came through before noon. I found out later from Nunez herself. She called me once, briefly, from a number I didn't recognize before things got complicated for her too. Her editor, Zachary, had been straightforward about it, told her the order had come directly from Ankara, told her the article was coming down, told her there was nothing he could do. She said he'd sounded tired more than anything. Like it wasn't the first time. The article was gone by 11:47. I know that because the official who'd been on the phone came back into the room where I was sitting and his posture had changed. Something released in the shoulders. That particular easing that happens when a problem has been partially managed. Not solved. Partially managed. He sat down across from me and explained the charge. Unauthorized data transmission from a protected UNESCO site. Minimum 2-year legal process under Turkish cultural heritage law. He read it from a printed form, which he then slid across the table for me to sign. I signed it. There wasn't much point in not signing it. Outside the room's small window, the plain was flat and gray, and the site was quiet. I sat in the chair and kept my hands on the table and waited to see what happened next. The official left the room around midday and didn't come back for a while, long enough that I started paying attention to the window. It was a small window, set high in the wall the way administrative windows always are, not to give you a view, but to let in light without giving you anything to look at. I had to stand to see through it properly, and I did that twice before I decided it wasn't worth the effort of pretending I wasn't watching. After that, I just sat with my chair angled toward it and watched. The first vehicle arrived about an hour after I signed the form. White, no markings, Ankara plates. Not a site vehicle. The site vehicles were all mud-colored and had the Project Consortium logo on the doors. This one was clean. That's the detail that stuck. Everything else on the Konya plain was coated in a fine gray dust by November. The accommodation block, the equipment sheds, the wheel arches of every truck that had been on site more than a day. This vehicle was clean. It had come a long way quickly, and someone had thought to wash it before it arrived. 2 more followed it. Same plates, same condition. The workers came out of the northern mound access about 20 minutes later. 6 of them, maybe 7. Hard to count through the window at that distance. They weren't wearing site gear. No high-vis vests, no knee pads, no the layered practical clothing you wear when you're going to spend time underground in a cold chamber. They were wearing what looked like standard-issue coveralls, the kind that don't belong to any particular profession. That's my way of saying they could have been from anywhere. They looked like men who had been told to move things, and that's what they did. The containers were sealed. Gray-green, military-adjacent, with latched lids and handles on both ends. I couldn't tell you what was inside them. I couldn't tell you how many there were. I stopped counting after 8 because counting made it feel like I was doing something, and I wasn't doing anything. I was sitting in a chair watching through a small window while the contents of Chamber 7 North got loaded into 3 clean vehicles with Ankara plates. Whatever the containers held, they were heavy. The workers moved in pairs and didn't hurry, but they didn't set anything down either. That kind of careful, continuous movement that means the weight is manageable, but you don't want to test it. I kept thinking about the stone platform. The grooves in it, the ones worn into the surface by something organic over a span of time I still couldn't quite hold in my head without it sliding away. 15,000 years minimum, probably more. Whatever had made those grooves had been doing it long before the Neolithic settlers built their mud brick houses above it, long before anyone thought to draw a map of this place or assign a stratum number to it. And now it was in a container. Or it wasn't. Maybe they'd left the platform. Maybe it was too heavy or too fixed to move. Maybe they'd only taken the portable things, the things that could be documented and transported and filed somewhere under a classification level I'd never be cleared to see. I didn't know. I still don't. The pulse had been at 9-second intervals on my last visit, down from 11. I thought about that while I watched the vehicles. Something in the fissure was accelerating, and now the fissure was either empty or sealed, or both, and I had no way of knowing whether that made things better or worse, or whether better and worse were even the right categories for whatever was happening down there. Garrett had heard it at 11 seconds and hadn't spoken coherently since. Woods had looked at the photographs and had a stroke within 48 hours. I'd been in the chamber 3 times and transmitted everything I had, and I was sitting in a detention room with a 2-year legal process ahead of me and my hands on a table, and I couldn't decide if that made me lucky or just slower to break. The last container went into the second vehicle around 2 in the afternoon. The workers folded back into the third vehicle without ceremony. No conversation I could see. No looking around. No particular acknowledgement that they'd just emptied a chamber that predated human civilization as anyone formally understands it. They moved like men finishing a job. The vehicles pulled out in a line heading north toward the main road, toward Kanya, and within a few minutes the dust from their wheels had settled, and the plain was flat and gray and quiet again, and the northern mound looked like it always had, just a low rise in the landscape, unremarkable. The kind of thing you drive past without slowing down. That was the last I saw of Chamber 7 North. The official came back in the late afternoon with tea, which I hadn't expected. He set it on the table without comment and sat down across from me and looked at his phone for a while. I drank the tea. It was too sweet, but I wasn't going to say so. At some point, I'm not sure when, the light through the window had gone flat and gray. I started thinking about the forum upload. The third transmission, the one I'd almost not included because it had felt redundant at the time. Because I'd already sent everything to Nunez and to Fields, and a third channel had seemed like excess. I'd included it anyway because I'd been standing in the field office at 2 in the morning with the satellite terminal humming and the USB drive in the port and the particular clarity you get when you've already made the decision and you're just executing it. So I'd uploaded the full archive to the public forum and logged out and disconnected the drive and waited for the security personnel from Kanya. The ministry could pressure a publisher. They could call Zachary and tell him the article was coming down and make it clear there was no version of events in which it stayed up, and Zachary, who had sounded tired more than anything, would comply. That's how suppression works when there's a single point of contact. You find the person with authority and you apply pressure and the thing disappears. A public forum doesn't have a Zachary. There's no one to call. By the time the ministry identified the thread, it had already been downloaded by people in 4 countries who had no particular reason to delete it and every reason to find it interesting, because it was interesting. Angular symbols from a stratum that shouldn't exist. Audio of a sub-80 Hz pulse with a 4-beat rhythm. Coordinates, photographs. A partial translation of wall inscriptions that didn't match anything in the established Çatalhöyük record. That's the kind of thing that spreads. Not because people are activists or because they're trying to cause trouble, but because it's genuinely strange and strange things move. Fields had forwarded the archive to 3 colleagues before Nunez's article was even retracted. I found that out later. Not in the detention room, but afterward, when things had settled into the long procedural grind of the legal process. And I had time to piece together what had happened while I was sitting in that chair. Fields had opened the email, looked at the photographs, and forwarded it within the hour. His colleagues had done the same. By the time anyone with the authority to intervene had identified the problem, the archive existed in too many places to locate, let alone remove. I'd known that was possible when I sent it. I hadn't known it would happen that fast. The official drove me to Kanya that evening. I sat in the back of a ministry vehicle and watched the plane go dark through the window, the sight receding behind us until the mounds were just 2 low shapes against the sky, and then nothing at all. I didn't look back for long. There wasn't much point. Here's what I know now, sitting far enough from it to talk about it plainly. The archive is out there. It's been translated, debated, contested, dismissed, and taken seriously by people with more credentials than me, and people with none at all. And the argument about what those symbols mean and what that chamber was and what was producing that pulse is ongoing, in the way that arguments about genuinely unresolved things tend to be ongoing, without resolution, without consensus, without any official body willing to confirm or deny what was in those containers or where they went. The ministry never commented on Chamber 7 North directly. They issued a statement about the unauthorized transmission, about the legal process, about the importance of protecting UNESCO-designated sites from unauthorized documentation. They did not mention the chamber. They did not mention the symbols. They did not mention the vehicles with Ankara plates, or the workers in unmarked coveralls, or the sealed containers that headed north toward Konya on a flat gray afternoon in November. Garrett is still in Oxfordshire. I know that because Patricia sends a brief update every few months, not to me specifically, but to a small group of people who've been following the case, and the updates are always the same. He's comfortable. He's receiving care. He still repeats the 4-beat sequence every 11 seconds, regular as a clock, without variation, without stopping. I think about that interval, 9 seconds it was, on my last visit. Down from 11. I think about what 8 would mean, and 7, and whether there's a number at the bottom of that sequence where something changes. And I think about the fact that whatever was in those containers left the site in November and is somewhere now, in some facility I'll never have clearance to enter. And the fissure in the bedrock is still there whether they sealed it or not. The archive spreads. That part I'm certain of. Whatever else is uncertain, and most of it is. That part I know. It's out there. It's already out.